What's going on, everybody, and welcome back into my studio, Byerly Studios, where I'm making awesome arts and crafts videos to share with you here on YouTube. If you're keeping up with this build, it is where I am building this 3D Angel Gnome Tumbler from Sculpey Original Clay. In the first video, we were able to completely craft it from head to toe in Sculpey Original. It even features little sandals. How awesome is that, guys? In the second video, which you're watching now, is where we're going to sculpt original removable wings for this bad boy. So sit back and enjoy as we create some awesome angel wings for an amazing tumbler. All right, everybody, so jumping into this video number 2 in this series where I'm hand sculpting this 3D Angel Gnome Tumbler from Sculpey Original. So the very first video, which is already posted, was me sculpting the actual Angel Gnome on the stainless steel tumbler. There's nothing really setting him apart from normal gnomes yet, except for his back where the cloak is going around the steel tubes. So I stated in the previous video that I had bought a steel tube and an aluminum rod from Home Depot, and I wanted to build detachable wings on the Angel, whether I wanted to make some different wings in the future or make them in different shapes. I wanted to incorporate a level and technique, something that I've never done before, that would really challenge me as an artist to do something different apart from the norm. And building a detachable portion of the tumbler is that next level. I think this is just a really cool effect, and the overall finish of this is just astonishing. I'm so proud of myself being able to push the limit. So the steel tube and shank was a great idea, but it was just way too thick and way too bulky for the overall finish that I wanted. It was way too big, and I had to shrink it down. So what I did is I cut those rods down to a shorter length. That way I could still use the existing tubes that I had already attached to the clay tumbler. And I gave this a good sanding and made sure that they were washed off of all metal debris, making sure they're as smooth as possible. And also by sanding it, it just took off a little bit of the metal so that they slid into the tubes a little bit better. My intention here is to allow a thicker gauge of armature wire to be wrapped around the stud, as it were, and then I would attach the clay to the thicker armature wire. So right now I'm just test fitting the rods in the tubes just to make sure they have a good fit. They are seating at an angle, and you'll see me come back a little bit later and add clay into the tubes until I get the buildup that I need to where they don't bind, because I had bent those rods. Here's the thicker armature wire. I'm going to wrap this around in different ways to get the overall shape that I want. And I made sure to get these as tight as possible around the stud as possible. I don't want it to move or twist too much once I begin to apply clay, but I'm relying on the clay to bond it to the material of the rod. Because I'm leaving gaps kind of like a coil, I want the clay to get in between those and bond to the metal. So you'll see me run through this process, sit back and enjoy, and then I'll catch you back at the next step. And you may be asking yourself, well, Mr. Byerly, what is this extra piece of wire just hanging onto the back? I decided to add one more level of intricacy to the overall design of these wings. And instead of just having two main arch wings coming off the back and then swooping around to the front, I decided to go ahead and add secondary wings as well. When it's all completed out, it's going to look really fantastic. It's going to add an extra level of dimension to the overall build, and it's going to look really cool. You'll see. Trust me, guys. So what I'm doing now is I'm adding a little bit of plastic or saran wrap to the tumbler itself. I don't want to have to worry about the raw clay bonding to the already cured clay that I have on the tumbler. I'm also using little rolls of clay to build up the material inside the tube so that the curved rod doesn't bind as it goes into those straight tubes. So I'm just building up the material so that it slides in and out easily without having it bind up at the curvature of the rod. And this also will allow the inside of the bottom of the tube to bind to the clay that's already around the bottom of the tube. So it's adding a little bit of extra strength to the bottom of the tube as well. So I'm going to go ahead and immediately run into bulking out the clay around the aluminum rod and the armature wire, and I want to go ahead and build that up so that way I have the strength between those. I'm pressing pretty firmly to make sure I get the clay in between all of the coils of armature wire, and when that clay cures, it's going to apply a lot of strength to that joint, so that way that no matter what I have coming off of those, because the wings are out away from the item, I want that joint to be extremely strong. Alright, so with the first side joint bulked out, that is going to sit there for quite a while. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work on the left hand wing completely first, and then I will come back around to the right hand side. So you'll see me run through the entire process on the left, and then I'll do just a really quick highlight clip of me finishing out the right hand side in the same way. So because I'm doing this a little bit at a time, I'm not planning it, I'm just going with the flow. The first one is always the roughest to do, and then the second time you do it, it gets easier and easier and easier. So the second one is just a lot faster. It didn't take me near as long just to work out the process and get it done. But the very first one, it just takes a little bit of time to get all my ducks in a row so that I can do it in an efficient manner. So I'm just kind of evening out those wings, trying to get those as even as possible. Now these are going to kind of move and shape and shift as I go along. You can see I'm wrapping a thinner gauge armature wire around the larger gauge. It gives something else for the clay to bond to as I start to bulk out the wing arches. Alright, so now that I got the general shape of the wings kind of down pat, how I kind of like them, as you can see here, I do have that top arch kind of swooping down towards his feet in the front, and that's going to kind of evolve over time. But what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to bulk out the clay on the very first wing here. I'm going to begin at the joint, work my way up to the top of the arches, and then I'll kind of build out the material as I go, all the way down and around. So these wings are multiple stages to get to the strength that I want when they're completely finished. When they're completely cured and I have all of the aspects built out, they really do have a lot of strength to them, but with that comes a lot of weight as well. So to help with those corner angles where the armature wire is bending, to apply temporary strength to those, I did build out the top parts of the wire so that they do look like a bone, like a rigid bone shape. That will kind of get blended out as I add features later on in the build. But it does add meat to the overall armature setup so that it just gives it strength. Alright, so I've got the first arch of the first wing blocked in, and I'm going to go ahead and begin the process of finding the overall shape of the insert wing that I would like to make. So I'm going to use a piece of scrap box here. I'm going to cut it up, and I'm going to slowly remove material until I get the overall shape that I want. Now I will use this shape for both sides, so I will have a mirrored effect, and it will just look very uniform for both sides. So I'm going to go ahead and continuously remove the meat from the box until I get the shape that I desire. And then I tried to push this into the clay just to keep it in place. I also tried to push it into the clay to create a crevice for the stained glass resin insert. I'm so excited to make this for you guys. I'm so excited to be able to test the product in a larger project like this. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be making a UV resin stained glass with mica powder. It's going to be absolutely gorgeous, and it's going to look spectacular when it's all painted up and finished. So I've got the general shape. As I said, I pushed that into the clay. It didn't work out. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to have something clear to put the actual resin on. So what I had bought is some of this tempered plastic glass from Hobby Lobby. It is located in the stainless glass section. It does not cut well with scissors, and that is what I used. It's all right. I made it happen, Captain. And we got this bad boy all cut out here. It likes to try to splinter with scissors, but when I'm applying the UV resin to it, it really doesn't matter. There I am cutting it out, and then we'll move on to the resin portion of the video, which is just absolutely a blast to make. Alright, so you can kind of see where that glass is kind of splittering. I also tried to cut it with an X-Acto knife and score it and then cut it. It really didn't matter. The UV resin is going to cover this up anyways. So I go ahead and form fit it to the arch. And originally what I wanted to do is I wanted to create individual feathers and make them individual colored stained glass. So this is my first attempt at it. So what I had used here is gallery glass simulated lead. It's a little bit softer. It's more of like a liquid based. It has the same consistency as puffy paint. And what I had intended to do is to make each one their own individual color, almost like in a rainbow pattern, or just, you know, different layers of colors. I changed up on this. This just didn't give me the overall effect I wanted. I included it. I think that this would have worked better if it hadn't have been so thick of lines. Maybe if I had used a different a dropper, maybe like a precision dropper with a thinner line. So that way I could just kind of keep control of where I want those barriers for the UV resin to sit into, kind of control where I want it to be. It's not necessarily a bad looking design, it's just not the effect that I wanted. So although I did show this and show what it looks like finished, I am going to peel this off. Now in hindsight, after I finished this process, I completely had forgotten that this tinted or glass had a piece of plastic on both sides to avoid scratching while it was in the store. So when I didn't like this effect, I was able to completely just peel this right off and start from scratch. I actually forgot that it had plastic on the both sides twice. So I ended up having to redo one of the UV sides later on in the process, just because I failed to remember that it had plastic on both sides. So we're starting off fresh. Now this is attempt number 2, and this goes a lot smoother, and I think it has a better design. So I went ahead and peeled that off, and I am going to trim off any of the remainder black segments on the exterior edges of that glass. Now, the very first layer here, I'm just going to layer in UV resin a little bit at a time. I'm holding it so that it has a slight curvature at the bottom of the wing. And I'm going to go ahead and layer in layer after layer after layer until I get the desired thickness. And I'll do this on both sides. Alright, so this is after the first 2 layers of UV resin on one side of the wing. And it still is pretty soft. It's not completely cured yet, so I'm trying not to leave too many fingerprints on that. But I'm applying that curvature to the bottom portion of that wing. I could have made the wings completely flat and straight, but I thought that would just be too basic. So to challenge myself, I decided to make them as curved towards the toes at the bottom of the wings as I could. Now, the glass resists this, so my attempt to remedy this is to apply UV resin to both sides of that tempered glass so that I could try to get it to force the glass into the curvature I want. Now with UV resin, if it hardens, it will stay on that shape for the most part. But if it heats up, it tries to revert back to its original shape, which is a flat surface. And later on in the process, I make the mistake of leaving this in a windowsill in full sun so that those UV rays can cure the UV resin even more than the light does. But the heat from the sunlight actually caused it to flatten out because the UV resin got not cured but too hot. So I had to go back and apply rubber bands to it, let it heat back up, and then apply that curvature to the glass again. And then what I did is I put the glass into the refrigerator, let it completely cool before I removed those rubber bands. And then at that point, it held the shape like it was supposed to. There's the curvature, as you can see. It turns out really great. They're very, very similar in shape. They both have the curvature towards the bottom of the wing like I wanted them to. And now we're going to start to layer in my mica powders. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay these out here in the order that I might use them. I'm using a very limited palette here. I could have used blue pearl dry, but it's too bright of a blue. I decided to leave it off. So we're going to use mist, bronze, I believe it was like a green pearl dry, and then I have powder as well, but I decided not to use very much powder. So I hit this with another layer of UV resin, and then I cure it for 2 minutes. Then it has a tacky surface to adhere the mica powder to the surface. I go ahead and with individual brushes, not to confuse colors, I go ahead and layer in the bronze. The bronze is going to shade and shadow where it will be making contact with the clay arch of the wing. Then I go ahead and begin with my green pearl dry, kind of like framing in where I want the blue to be, and then the blue will be in the very middle. Now, this isn't supposed to give full saturation and block out light. It's supposed to be a nice light layer to apply pigment to the item so that you can see light through the item. It's stained glass, right? So it's supposed to be simulated stained glass. You don't want to block the light out. You just want to give it some pigment, some color, give it some life, and then let it be. So once this process is done, I'll go ahead and I tried to attempt to add a little bit of a darker mica powder to the exterior bronze, just to darken that. I didn't really need to, and it really didn't change the effect. Alright, so with those pretty much done on the mica powder, I go ahead and give it a gentle brush off. It also helps to blend those colors a little bit from the hard edges. And then I apply a nice flood coat of UV resin to the side. Now the flood coat does take a little bit of the texture away that I had left in the previous layers of UV resin, but I mainly want those previous layers just to give texture for the mica powder to settle into and just to give distinguishing variations and levels. With the flood coat, it doesn't really matter. I just want to get full coverage so that that mica powder doesn't get displaced or moved during the other processes of the build. So it just seals it into place and it keeps it from moving around. Now this is only the first layer on the first side, so we're going to go ahead and let that set up, and I want that side to cure completely before we flip it over and do the other side. So this is just one layer of color from one side. In the top right hand corner you can see it did lose some of its curvature, so I reapply that curvature by sitting in a windowsill so that layer can completely cure, but I apply rubber bands to add tension to it to keep that curvature in place. So that way as I mentioned before, when the heat hits it, it has a tendency to flatten back out just because of gravity. Those rubber bands keep that curvature in place like I want them to be. Once they're fully cured, we'll move on to the second layer of color on the opposite side. And all it does is it enriches the overall depth of the color. So the same process again, just sit back and enjoy the time lapse as I knock out the second layer of color on the opposite side. Alright, so with the second layer almost done, what I do this time with the UV resin is I try to run it along the exterior edges just to give it some added protection. So those edges are what are going to be pushed up into the raw clay once these things are completely cured. And then that will allow me to get the overall depth and shape that I need to continue with the curvature of the wings, get them locked in, get them blocked in the way I need to, and then I can finish building out the clay feathers of the wing arches. So there it is in all its glory. Hit it with UV resin. Oh no, where did it go? Just kidding. Here they are, all completed and finished up. You can see that the color is a little bit more deep than it was before, but the light does shine through, and it is brilliant, guys. Absolutely gorgeous in every single way, and I can't wait to use this for other projects. All right, so with the main wings done, we're going to move on to the secondary back wings. Now they're slightly smaller, and I did go ahead and add some fun designs to these. So they're going to have some jagged portions to them. Now these are smaller pieces of that same tempered glass. So what I did is I used the same overall method to bend them, and add the UV resin and the mica powders, and all of that stuff is exactly the same. The only thing that changed the variable is when I was applying pressure to them to bend them, the middle of it snapped. I was like, well, I don't really want to waste it. It's not really necessarily a bad thing. It's a happy little mistake, and we're just going to run with it. So I added UV resin to it, and you can't tell that it's broken unless you really look really deep at it. And I think it adds a really cool effect to it. So I went ahead and I'm going to bend the wing arches on the back of the angel to mimic this same shape. And it's just going to add curvature to it that is a little bit different. It's still curvature, it's still not completely flat, so I'm kind of happy with it. So we're brushing that off, and then we're going to add the UV resin to it, just like we did the previous portion of the build. So here they are, same concept, looking absolutely stunning in every single way. And I like it all because it's super matchy-matchy. All the wings look very similar in color combination, and they're going to look even better when they're added to those beautiful, beautiful wings. Here they are all laid out. I love the shine of them when they are applied under lights. So now what I'm going to begin doing is I'm going to start building out the clay material around where the arch of the wing makes contact with the edges of the resin wing itself. So I'm just going to apply thin lines of clay, blend that into the main arch itself, and almost give it just a blended effect onto the UV resin. And then when I get this overall kind of build finished out, then I can pull that UV resin portion of the wing out and away from the clay before adding the feathers. So that way when I get it completely finished, I get it completely baked out, then I can come in with some E6000 adhesive and I can set the wing glass into the wing arch. So I'm going to go ahead and finish building out the back wing as well. And here you can see that I removed some of that material where the break will be between the two portions of the wings. And what I intend to do is I intend to have that sanded down so I can apply either a thin piece of carpet or some kind of fabric between the two so that it has pressure tension between them to keep them from shifting and moving around, but also so that they're easily removed if I choose to do so. So here you can see I'm just continuously adding that clay in, adding the bridge between the arch of the wing and then the resin itself. I want it to be kind of a sandwiched effect so that when I remove that resin portion of the wing, it leaves a void there for me to glue the wing back into place after baking. So I'm also trying to smooth a lot of this out. And then here in a moment, you'll see that I will go through and I'll add a bunch of detail and striations to the wings, like muscles, and add tissue here and there. I did not need to do any of this. It was completely wasted motions. You'll see in the very end highlight clips of me making the second wing that I don't do any of these extra movements. It's always in hindsight after you make something that you realize that you could have done things differently or not wasted movements in making something. So, but that's okay. It's just part of the creation process. So still smoothing things out, kind of texturing that, making that line as seamless as possible so that way when I remove that wing, then it leaves a nice smooth surface. So I used a mold here and I only used a few of these to give the same overall shape through the entire wing effect on the tumbler itself. So what I did is I started at the top, but actually I decided to start from the bottom instead. And that way I can kind of layer them in so that they're kind of layering down the arch of the tumbler. Now, these are a little bit thicker than I had intended them to be, but I'm not really upset by this. It really adds a lot of strength to the overall build. And when the UV resin portion is in place, they really stouten out and it adds a lot of strength to the overall design of the build. The more clay I have on that exoskeleton or armature wire, the stronger it's going to be and the less likely it's going to break. So I decided to add a little bit of meat at the very top arch just to add a little bit more strength, and then I continue those feathers all the way up. And then I'll do the same thing to the secondary wing all the way up, and then I'll joint that into the main wing itself. So you can see I have the clay portion sticking up, ready for me to join those to the main portion of the wing. And then I'll just fold those in so that it looks like it's all one seamless piece of feather. And then there it is. There's the very first wing all completed out and ready to be baked. Now I baked this at 275 for 15 minutes. And the great thing about this is, so I laid it down on my baking pan with parchment paper to bake the actual wing itself. I hated doing that just because it added a little bit of a flat surface to one of the feathers. It's okay, I'll fix that with some paint. But then what happened is after it was baked and it was still hot, I was able to use the tumbler itself and seat the wing where it needs to be on the tumbler, and it cooled while it was sitting upright on the tumbler itself, which is pretty cool. So the left-hand side is already cured and setting there ready to be worked on later. And then I'm going to run through very quickly the second wing itself. So I'm going to go ahead and build out the meat between the two wings, and what I'll do is I'll build out the meat between them so that way I can come in and I can cut a portion away. I'm just kind of gauging how thick I think the carpet would be between the two items. That way I'll be able to remove them easier than if it's just clay on clay. Now, I also am thinking about how I want it to be covered. I want UV or epoxy to be applied to the seam between the wings, so that carpet is very important so that way it's not tacky between the two items. I'm going to go ahead and finish building out the material around the UV resin, similar to how I did for the other side. Alright, so with that done, oh, magically I'm already done with the feathers all the way up the tumbler. It's okay, you've seen that before. Now you can see between the left-hand side, which is cured and baked, and the right-hand side, which is the raw clay, the right-hand side, it does have a lot of bounce to it because it's not cured, it's not set in stone, so it's got a lot of give to it. Now these wings do have a lot of weight as well, so I need to make sure that UV resin is set in there properly. But before I can do that, I need to smooth out the joint where it makes contact with the back of the tumbler and the other wing. So I'm going to go ahead and smooth this out so that way I have a smooth surface to UV resin and then apply a piece of carpet too. So I had used some of the little clippers there to remove some excess UV resin from the wings, and then I hand scrubbed them with soap and water and dried them with a paper towel before applying E6000 to the void that we had left when we sculpted the wings. And now I'm going to put the wing into its home, its void there. I'm just going to use as much pressure as I dare to push that into its socket, and then I will push the back portion of the wing onto the bronze there. So it's just enough pressure to where I don't break the wing itself. I'm trying not to break anything, right? And then what I did is I used my finger just to remove any of the E6000 residue that had squeezed out from the joint. I wish I hadn't have done this. It actually smeared it and it left a film on the UV resin panel that I had to scrape off. It was kind of time consuming and just a waste. I used a paper towel too, but then the paper towel debris kind of stuck to it. I just didn't like it. I hated it. And here in a few minutes when I do the other portions of the wings, I actually use just a flat bladed sculpting tool to scrape the E6000 globs away from that joint. And it's a lot more neat and tidy than just smearing it with a finger to remove it. I'm going to apply some rubber bands. It's really not necessary, but at the same time, when I applied pressure to the arch and then the wing itself, they were able to push further together when I applied pressure. So I went ahead and applied pressure with the rubber bands, and I will do this to all 4 wings. So sit back and enjoy the show as I run through this process with the remainder wings here. All right, everybody, how awesome did this portion of this build turn out? These angel wings turned out so beautifully ornate with the feathers and the UV resin stained glass. I'm so glad that I was able to push the envelope of what I've made before by using the steel tube and the aluminum rod, all of the armature wire, and then the UV resin just to apply that next level that's going to add even more detail to this beautiful, beautiful project. So the next portion after this one will be video number 3, and it will probably be me designing and building his angel horn that he will be holding in his hands. I still don't know how I want to do that yet, but I do know that it's going to contain a counterbalance due to the fact that the wings are fairly heavy and want to tilt the tumbler. So those will apply a counterbalance to the weight of the wings. But look how amazing these things turned out. The feathers add just that next level all the way around, and then when they're painted, they're going to look absolutely stunning with the color of that UV resin. So as you can see, the flat bladed tool is so much better at removing the E6000 residue. Now here are some glamour shots of it with its rubber bands in place and the wings mounted where they need to be. They look super ornate, super glamorous. Look at the stained glass UV resin. And now what we're going to do is I want to apply just the extra few details, and I'm going to use air dry clay to apply just a few scattered feathers that kind of cascade down over the UV resin panels, just to add a little bit of variation to that existing build, and then those will be blended with paint to the rest of the feathers on the arches. So here's just a really quick process of me just pulling those out of the molds and just applying them in place. They really didn't want to stick to that UV resin, so I may just paint them separate and just place them in where I need to with E6000 after the fact. But otherwise, they're absolutely stunning.
The turbulence, and it's concerning. I've been searching for a purpose, I hope it's worth it. This society is really trying me. Ain't no hide and seek, I hide to be far from anxiety. I need my space, I need my privacy. I need some silence, please.
I know that this video ran a little bit long, around 45 minutes. But it is chock full of tons of information and content, and I really invested a lot of time into some of these videos. So I hope y'all really do enjoy the overall content that I'm putting out. If you did like this content, please subscribe, hit the thumbs up button, and I will catch you guys on the next amazing video. Later, guys.
I can hear the demons call when they do what they do, and now I feel like taking off.